So a lot of people ask, why are Christians the group most likely to own guns and carry guns in the United States? Isn't Christianity a pacifist religion? Well, let's talk about the Two Swords Fallacy. And we're going to talk about the Two Swords Fallacy using historically inaccurate Jesus. Now, the Two Swords Fallacy revolves around two verses from the book of Luke that is taken out of context. Specifically, we're talking about Luke 22:36 and 22:38. So in Luke 22:36, Jesus tells the disciples, if you do not have a sword, sell your cloak and go buy one. And some unnamed disciples, we'll just use Judas here, are like, bet, and they go shopping. And while they're gone, Jesus begins to prepare the Last Supper. And eventually the disciples, here's Peter, they return with the swords and they're like, hey, Jesus, here's two swords. And Jesus, who had been preparing the Last Supper while they were gone, sees this and is like, yeah, that's good. That's perfect. That is the right amount of swords. Now, before we move forward to see what happens after the disciples return with the swords, we need some context. So let's go back to moments before all of this happened to see what's going on. So right before Jesus sent his disciples to get the swords, he threw a huge party that we'll call the Sermon on the Mount. Now, the Sermon on the Mount is found in Matthew's chapters 5 through 7. And in it, Jesus just says, hey, we need to change the way we do things. And that if you make those changes, you'll be blessed. And we call those the Beatitudes. So things like, blessed are the poor and the meek. So what are some examples of things that he wanted us to change? Well, so in Matthew 5, he's like, hey, I know you all have been taught that we're supposed to do this an eye for an eye thing, but maybe let's not do that anymore, okay? And he says things in it like, if someone tries to mug you, then give them more than they were trying to take. And if someone punches you in the face, then you should turn your face so they can hit you again so it's even. And he goes on to say that if you end up unalive because you didn't fight back, well, just know you pleased my Father. And so this goes on for a while. He gives all these new updates and things to Jewish law, right? He says he's not there really to change it, but he really does. That is what he actually does. And at the end of it, he goes back to prepare the Last Supper. And yeah, so then Jesus does the whole sacrament of the Last Supper, the body and blood thing. And then he gives the side eyes like, and one of you is going to betray me. And that's probably the point in the story where Judas turns around and looks at him and goes, I know he ain't talking about me. But it's not long after that soldiers burst in and they're like, hey, Jesus, you're going to prison. Come with us. And the disciples all jump up and they're like, oh shit, Jesus is arrayed. What do we do? But Jesus just kind of sits there. He's probably really upset that he didn't even get to have his cheesy biscuits. And he doesn't say anything until Peter leaps over the table like he's John Wick and cuts off the ear of one of the soldiers. And immediately Jesus is like, what the fuck? And Jesus immediately chastises Peter and says, those who draw the sword are doomed to die by it. And then he heals the soldier. So yeah, it was all a test. When he asked his disciples to go buy swords, he wanted to see if they had been paying attention to the things he actually said on the Sermon on the Mount. Would they allow whatever was going to happen? Because that's really the message. Let things happen as they are supposed to. And this is one of the long-running themes of the New Testament. Jesus constantly says, I am here in fulfillment. These things have to happen. And so by Peter acting the way that he did, he is saying, I don't trust you. And modern Christians today, especially evangelicals, tend to focus on just those two verses, where he tells them to buy a sword, and then he tells them, yeah, you did a good job. But then they ignore all of the context before and after those two verses. Those two verses have been used to justify self-defense, and that's why today Christians own and carry guns at higher rates than the average American. And in our research, we also see this. Our research showed that evangelicals want fewer restrictions placed on gun ownership, and they want to be allowed to carry guns in more places so that they can serve as soldiers for God. In our paper, Peace Through Superior Firepower, Belief in Supernatural Evil and Gun Policy Attitudes in the United States, we find this to be true. Now, we were looking at belief in supernatural evil, which is comprised of three distinct belief systems. First, that hell is a literal physical place that you can go to. Second, there are literal demons who are trying to destroy you. And third, the devil is a real entity who is testing you and trying to get your soul. So basically, they believe they're just monsters everywhere, and they need guns to fight them off because they could be out here trying to steal your girlfriend. Because again, they view themselves as soldiers for God, and they need to be armed and in the armor of God to fight them off. And the arms are literal in this case. And the idea that you need to be armed to fight off literal demons is actually called the just war theory. Basically, it's a theory that tries to justify things in the Bible that say you shouldn't harm other people with the idea that we as human beings have a right to self-defense as well as participate in war. Because in this theory, it's not you that is doing the fighting. Instead, it's God fighting through you, so you're just the tool used to stop evil. Because in this worldview, evil is a monolith, and it can be stopped by a person. And so if we limit their abilities to fight back, we are allowing evil to win. And this is not a new rhetoric. It has been used over and over since the Crusades. One of the more recent times was after 9/11, George Bush said, there is a great evil that we have to stop. So yeah, the just war theory, this is why. Thoughts?